Hello and welcome to Meeting People with me, Amal Pandya. Meeting People is a podcast where I have long conversations with rebellious, adventurous and sometimes courteous free spirits. Professor Toombs, thank you very much for sparing the time and for having us in your inspiring rooms here. That makes me feel very under-read and under-resourced mentally to have this conversation, but we'll do our best if that's all right. Now, you're a professional historian who's, reached almost, if I don't mean to make you blush, but the top of your game or your field in many ways. I just thought it would be...
Well, it's kind of you to say so. Hope I'm not over the hill now.
No, I'm sure there's always more to climb and more to do, but I thought it would be helpful for people to contextualize for the people who are watching, listening, to kind of hear about how it is and when it was that you realized, history is my path. This is, for me, the study of history is how I can kind of best contribute to the world.
Well, that's a good question. And I think I'm one of those people who didn't really have a career planned out. I didn't think at the age of 13 what I want to be as a historian. I assumed, I was the first member of my family to go to university. But I thought then, I go to university because that's what you're supposed to do. And I have to study something, so I quite like history, so I'll read history. And then I'll get a job, in the civil service, or I even thought of working for the BBC, which now seems strange, considering that I'm sometimes a critic of the BBC. Or I would do something like that. But the idea of actually being a historian for the whole of my life came to me, I suppose, later. I did a PhD, partly because I didn't know what else to do at the time, and it seemed a nice thing to do, because at that time, now a lost world, the academic life seemed in many ways very attractive. Fortunately, it still is for some people, but then it seemed to offer freedom, to do the sort of things you're interested in, freedom to say the things you wanted to say, not too much pressure, not too much pressure to keep producing things. We used to mock the Americans for that. This was something that you could, if you wanted to spend 10 years on writing a book, that was fine. If you wanted to do something completely different, everyone would applaud, or at least they would not try to stop you. And so that was the sort of thing that appealed to me. I thought freedom, no one was your boss at that time. It was a very sort of flat organisation. I'm talking about Cambridge now, but I suppose it was true of most universities. So I remember the first time anyone ever mentioned to me a line manager. I had no idea what a line manager was, and I said, "Well, I don't have a line manager." In fact, I didn't.
And this is
no
before
one did.
tenure. This is even
It was. I think what changed things was partly the need, to make universities more commercial. You could say, I don't have a strong opinion on this, but the idea that you had to greatly increase the number of people going to university meant that universities could not all be paid for out of the public purse. Therefore, it would have to be paid for by fees and by competition for research funding, much of which goes to the universities for their running costs. And by recruiting a lot more students, recruiting overseas students, the whole university system became much more like a commercial corporation, and in which the academics in some ways are the workers on the factory floor. They're no longer, it seems to me, in many ways, a liberal profession of independent scholars. They are often a sort of proletariat.
A necessary evil for the functioning
I suppose so. Or at least, the people who are there to produce, do the teaching, produce the research in order to keep the whole institution afloat financially. And therefore, if I were to say, I can do what I like now because I'm retired. But, if someone in their 30s or 40s was to say, look, I've got this idea for a new project. It'll take me a long time to get it done, but I think when it's done, it will be important. They'd probably be told, well, the research assessment exercise is in 2 years' time. You've got to have produced a certain number of outputs by then. And if you don't, you can forget about promotion, or you can forget about being given a permanent job, and so on. And also, it's become much more, this is an old man lamenting the golden age of his youth, but the whole system has become, in a sense, corrupted. I'm not saying that individuals are corrupt, but research funding has become very much part of the fuel of the system. And so people, it's well known, people don't deny it, they sort of joke about it. You need to raise the maximum amount of research funding. So what you need to do is come up with a research project that can be the pretext for a very large amount of money. And that's how people think. And it has to fit certain parameters. It can't be too unorthodox. It certainly can't go against the zeitgeist. Because in that case you won't get funding. In that case you'll be in big trouble with your employers. So again, the universities have become not communities of scholars, but machines for generating income, generating revenue, in which, as I say, the academics are the shop floor workers.
And so just going back to before you, it sounds like you fell into it, and you're making.
I did rather.
So there was no sort of precocious sort of 6-year-old professor to sort of reading Herodotus and going, "Oh, this is my."
I did read history though, but it wasn't something I thought of doing professionally.
Yeah.
It's something I quite enjoyed, and I liked the stories and so on. No, I did fall into it really.
Before we go into the history side of things, maybe just sticking to the university institution more broadly. I've heard it said that it's becoming an anachronism. The kind of value of a university was 600 years ago when all the books were in one place, and so it made sense to congregate around where all the books are.
Yes.
And then you will congregate, whereas today, obviously, that's no longer the case. And actually what the value of the university has turned into, excuse me, almost a sort of a signalling exercise or an expensive club that you can waive membership for. So you see this phenomenon now, apparently in Silicon Valley, for example, where you'll get a smart 18-year-old getting the acceptance letter to Harvard or Cambridge or whatever it is, and going to Google and saying, "Look, I got in, but I don't actually want to go because I don't want to get in debt, and I don't want to party for 3 years. I'd rather work and learn." And so the bulk of the value of going to an elite institution like the one that we're sat in actually comes from showing that you've got the aptitude to get in rather than actually being there.
Yes.
Do you worry about that being true, and therefore the universities needed to kind of reinvent themselves in some way?
It doesn't worry me a huge amount. I mean, I think it's true that universities, in recent times at least, of course not always, because after all, anybody who could afford the fees could go to university at one time. And there were some pretty dim undergraduates when I was an undergraduate, and indeed after. But the idea of the university as the body that selects the most intelligent people and gives them a certificate is I suppose, relatively new. But, the example you give of someone who said, "Well, look, I've got into Harvard or Cambridge, therefore I don't actually need to go, give me a job instead," that seems to me fine in certain sorts of careers. Because after all, if you want to work, let's say, in computers, you might well think that it's more important for you could learn more working for a company than you could doing a university course. So why not do that? It saves you time, it saves you money, it saves everybody else a lot of trouble. I think that a bit. I would make a comparison with the City of London, where I know you work. You could say, well, why on earth do we need to have a City of London when people could be sitting at home, or all over the world, doing all this on their computers? Except it still seems to be the case that human contact and people getting together informally actually works. And I think certainly for universities, not so much as for teaching undergraduates, though that still remains a very important part of our job. It seems to me the most socially important part, arguably. But especially in the sciences, clearly, the fact that you have a lot of young scientists working together under an older professor is how they learn. And although in theory they could probably do it dispersed around the world, in practice they can't, partly because they need a lot of often very expensive equipment, but also, it's well known, it's often sitting down over a coffee and having a chat that gives you an idea. And I was talking to a scientific colleague the other day who said, he's got a team of 20 people working for him. And I said, well, do you just tell them all what to do? Or do you ask them to come up with ideas? And he said, I ask them to come up with ideas.
Right.
And then I can tell them if I think the idea is any good or not. But if they weren't all there together, then this wouldn't happen, of course. It would be a much more impersonal and remote kind of activity.
It sounds like that core function, that research function, or the kind of producing academic work has become very gatekeepered.
I suppose it always has been.
It always has been.
Perhaps it has to be.
Do you think there's room for sort of decentralized research, particularly in the sciences? What you've alluded to is that you end up getting this kind of groupthink where you're more likely to get funded. You get the cart before the horse,
Yes.
so you propose projects that get funding rather than
Yes.
projects that deserve. And also you get that kind of, right-wing professors will more likely, give funding or approve PhD theses, or left-wing, professors will more likely approve PhD theses that conform to their ideology, and we know which way the universities are kind of are on that spectrum.
Well, I think perhaps I have a rather starry-eyed view of the sciences from having friends and colleagues who work in the sciences, but it seems to me that's much less of a problem there, and it's partly because it's highly competitive, and so you're not going to give research posts to people who simply agree with you politically, because your research team would be less strong and you would not get funding, and it's in your interest, therefore, to have the best people producing the best work. Okay, there may be certain fields now in which, let's say, ideology is infecting the sciences. I mean, we all know what they are. The most obvious one is things to do with gender, and no doubt psychology, if that's a science. Psychologists, if you're listening. But it clearly, I don't think it happens in mathematics or the so-called hard sciences to the same extent. There may be different kinds of corruption, if you like. People might do each other favors and so on, and help each other to get jobs or help each other to get grants. But that just seems to be part of human nature. But there will still be the pressure to produce good work, because that's how you succeed in that. It's a very competitive and meritocratic profession. Now, the humanities, I think, are somewhat different, and I think that the decision by governments now some time ago, I don't know if it was really Margaret Thatcher who started it off, or Blair who kind of pushed it further, but to force the humanities into a science template, I think has been damaging. I mean, most humanities work is A, cheap, and B, it's often done by individuals working on their own, doing it in the evening, doing it at weekends, occasionally going to conferences, going to work in archives or whatever. But we've been forced into trying to do it in a way that maximizes grant income. So it has tended to, as I said a moment ago, it's tended to influence the kind of research that is done and how it's done.
And it's easier to corrupt the humanities because there's no right answer.
And also there's no right answer. Well, actually, I mean, there are right answers, as it were. There's no, but that's true in the sciences too. You may have a research project that actually ends up in the end being disproved, and that can happen in history. I suppose it can't happen so much in literature, but even so, there are ways of testing hypotheses and trying to reproduce results as there are in the sciences. But not so much, I agree, and also there's not so much urgency. I mean, I feel one reason why it's a pity that we went down that path, though many of my colleagues wouldn't agree, because they quite like having big research grants, because it means that they can have several years sabbatical leave and not have to do any teaching.
Yeah,
which is fair enough. Who wouldn't? But there's not usually any urgency to have a new biography of Gladstone, let's say. The world is not waiting for this. It's not like finding a cure for some loathsome disease. You might say, well, if he does his biography of Gladstone in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, what does it matter? My PhD supervisor took 35 years to complete a biography of a 19th century French politician.
Wow.
And nobody thought there was anything wrong about. I mean, he was doing other things in the meantime, including during the Second World War. But No one thought, this is desperately sad that this biography has not yet been produced, because eventually it came out and it was interesting. It wasn't intended to change the world, and most humanities work is like that. It's not, and so the idea that you have to produce by a certain deadline, or you miss out, the system punishes you, or that you have to find lots of other people to join you in doing this as a collective project, seems to me often to be misguided.
It's trying to put a market or commercial angle to something that isn't meant for that.
Yeah.
For that purpose. Yeah. Am I right from memory that Winston Churchill was told he wasn't smart enough to go to uni? And
yes, that's right.
He was to join the army instead, and it was just, putting his political career to one side, the output that he had in terms of biographies of Marlborough, history of England, all that kind of stuff, was just extraordinary to hear that this guy was, in inverted commas, too thick to go to uni. Today would just feel extraordinary.
It would. That's a very interesting point, and I don't know the grounds on which that was decided. I guess it was his family who decided, wasn't it? Because at that time, if he'd wanted to go to university, he could have done. I mean, it may have been his father who said, Winston, your reports from Harrow are not good enough. You can go into the army because you're obviously stupid. But I don't suppose it was a very rigorous selection process to put it mildly. Okay,
so it wasn't Oxford or Cambridge or whoever it is saying, sorry, you're not. It was more of the family kind of.
Yeah, I think so. Well, that would be my guess. I don't actually know, but until within living memory, it was not very difficult to get in here because not all that many people wanted to come. It's not like now when you have the whole world wants to. Yeah. And so I think the universities have changed very much. Of course, they've become international institutions. So I often think that Cambridge is in fact an international corporation that happens to be in the Fens.
So going deeper into history, away from academia more broadly into history, I think I'm being terribly original by describing history as a important profession but a very dangerous hobby. Now I'm sure someone else has said that.
It's rather nice.
I hear a lot, there's a bit of a resurgence of this concept of applied history, and you've described the humanities, this sort of scientific template being pushed on the humanities in some ways. So using history as a kind of a tool to make policy, let's say, or predict the future.
Yes.
Now, actually, we know that it's often used as, for rhetorical flourishes or for propaganda purposes. Do you think history, what's the purpose of history? Can it be used to make better policy, to vote better, or is it actually something more, is that just kind of dirtying it? It's actually something more sacred and more important than that.
Well, I've always thought that history was a useful subject in the sense that it had relevance to our life as a society, both national and international. So I've never thought that history is simply a hobby, as some people think. And to some extent, all history is political, as all education is political.
Sorry, let me just distinguish then. So what I meant by the hobby thing is you're the professional going to the source material, processing vast swathes of information, trying to kind of consolidate it into some sort of discernible narrative or understanding for people like me who are the hobbyists, who will listen to history podcasts or read your work, and then I'll go and vote, or I'll become a politician or a investor or whatever it might be, and use your work to kind of twist it to my own ends in a way that so what those who had failed to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat it. We've had that. Or Churchill advised someone, history, for therein lies the secret to statecraft. I know history is sort of used by us hobbyists to pursue our own ends at worst. And does it frustrate you when you listen to politicians, let's say, kind of, we're on the right side of history here, or you're, that kind of thing, I guess, is what I meant by...
Yes. Does it annoy me? Well, I think that's always been part of historical writing and historic. It annoys me more when people have absolutely no interest in or absolutely no sense of history.
Right.
You the example you gave about being on the right side of history is one, which is a meaningless phrase, and yet it is quite a powerful one. It's quite a powerful piece of rhetoric that people use. So that is, in a way, annoying, or at least it's something that you might feel that you want to contest when people say it. And another thing that I find slightly irritating is when people say things like, it's incredible that this is happening in the 21st century, as if the 21st century is somehow the pinnacle of human achievement, and everything in the past was terrible, and we fortunately have now reached a state of sort of nirvana in which everything's wonderful. But we know that's not true. There are many things that it's not at all surprising it happens in the 21st century. Very horrible things are very typical of the 21st century. So I think, what, in a sense, if there's a general moral point, I think one ought to sort of combat the idea that history is a sort of conveyor belt of progress in which everything newer is better and everything past is bad. So, people often say medieval when they mean something, whereas of course the Middle Ages were in many ways it was a time of cultural achievement which we could probably not match today.
Can you define Whig history? Because that sounds like Whig. The beauty of this podcast, a podcast like this, is things that we feel we should know, we don't know, and then we hear people say things like, that's such a Whiggish.
Yeah, okay.
Can you it sounds like you're talking about a kind of Whig view of history where there's this arc of progress.
There is, yes, indeed. I mean, I think that it could be that the idea of progress is a crucial myth of the modern age, one that we can't really do without. If we don't feel that we are progressing, or at least are capable of progress, then what is it which, people may lose all sense of direction. But Whig history is a particular variety of this, as it were, progressive myth. And it is, as you know, it's based on the sort of history that was told by Whig intellectuals and Whig politicians mainly in the 18th century and the early 19th century. So it is the story of, first of all, of English history, and then of British history, and then of the British world, including the United States, where it seems to me Whig history is still quite lively, and to some extent of the whole world, which is to say, the past was a time of darkness, conflict, and superstition, and we emerged from that through the fight against monarchy, through the growth of Parliament, through the Protestant religion, and through enlightenment and respect for individual rights and individual intellectual freedom, and eventually we got to democracy, and that is what the whole of history has, in a sense, been aiming at. There's a famous American historian who talked about the end of history at the end of the Cold War. In a sense, the Whig story is about the end of history. It's about the end of history being the triumph of parliamentary democracy, and in some ways the triumph of the British Empire. And so I think that's one reason why Whig history has been so much attacked in this country, because it assumes a happy end. It assumes the end in which you have succeeded in everything and your system is perfect. All right, possible it can still be improved, but it's in principle it's all fine. And when after the dissolution of the empire, when Britain met post-war problems, then suddenly this story didn't seem to make sense anymore. What's happened to the happy ending? And then you had, of course, lots of criticisms of so-called Whig history by liberals, but also from the left, which you have, a Marxist history replaces this, in which it's the history is about class struggle and about the hoped-for future revolution. Or in the case of Britain, why we didn't have a revolution and therefore why we're so unsuccessful now. So, as I say, I think in America it kind of still, the great American dream is a kind of Whig dream. It's about how America is the greatest, the hope of all mankind, the city on a hill, the place where people go to succeed, and the place where, used to be the place where the poor of the world were supposedly welcomed to help to build the country. That's a kind of Whig story too, and it comes from the the same origins. But I suppose that now is also breaking down in America.
Well, interesting you say that. It feels from from what I'm seeing in America now, this sort of, we've almost passed the baton onto them. You hear American exceptionalism as a term much more than you hear European, let's say, exceptionalism,
Oh, yes.
or British exceptionalism.
Yes.
And they see themselves as a continuation of the legacy that we've kind of left them or handed to them.
Yes.
You touched on...
That was probably a Churchillian view too.
Right.
The history of the English-speaking peoples, and the idea is that, Britain, the famous phrase that Macmillan used about we would be the Greece to America's Rome. So the sense that, somehow Britain is the heart, is the origin of human progress, if you like, the mother of parliaments and all that, and we do pass this on to the Americans as we, a middle-aged or elderly society, are passing it on to the new and dynamic society of North America. So I think that was certainly something that was quite comforting for some people in Britain. I mean, that's why we keep going on about the special relationship, which implies all that, I think, really. And for Americans, the idea of American exceptionalism, as you say, that America is the last best hope of mankind.
Well, this is why some people argue that people like Elon Musk and Donald Trump, to an extent, are taking such interest in Britain, because they see us as their kind of elder brother or elder cousin, or the Greece to their Rome, and they kind of feel sad to see, what's happening here versus what the positives that they believe that they are reinstituting in America. What I found really interesting is the parallels that you brought up in your work about England being Carthage and France being Rome, and it feels like Europe is kind of Rome now. It's that kind of the noble, genteel, civic virtues versus that kind of commercial, materialistic Carthage, and we would have been in a very different place had the Romans not so brutally did to Carthage what they did once they managed to succeed. But do you find that America's taken England's mantle almost versus what England used to be as that foil to Europe?
I suppose so. The Carthage-Rome analogy is French, as you said, and it's mainly an 18th century French revolutionary period formulation. So on one hand, as you say, France, therefore, revolutionary France, or indeed monarchical France, stands for idealism, and the British stand for vulgar materialism. And you could say, well, that's as an idea that has not entirely gone away.
No.
Even at the time of Brexit, you would have. It wouldn't be difficult to find French people saying, well, the British don't appreciate the idealism behind the European project. They just think of it as a commercial organisation, and they say, well, we're not making any profit from it, therefore we'll leave it. Whereas we in France know that this is a way of, safeguarding the values of European civilization. And many people did think that, or do think that.
But the fun twist on that is, wasn't it a lot of French Enlightenment thinkers found France quite stultifying?
Yes.
So Voltaire, for example, you would come to England and feel, now I can think. And I can...
Yes.
And Montesquieu as well. I think, was it Montesquieu said that, if liberty is going to be preserved in Europe, it'll be from Britain, not from the
Yes. Yes, he did say that. He said very nice things, because the greatest of the Enlightenment political theorists, really. But he also said that Britain was very corrupt. So, you have on one hand, you say, well, yes, okay, maybe modernity is about what we would now call capitalism. Modernity is about people making money, about economic growth, but we don't necessarily like it. We may have to accept it, but there are higher values, and it's a pity that we have to accept that people like the Americans or people like the British are the ones who seem to be showing us the future, because it's not necessarily a future we terribly much like. And I mean the French in the 18th century and the EU today, and particularly the French within the EU, do see the protection of European culture as a major project. So, even if it's fairly trivial things like having a quota on American films, protecting the French cinema industry from international competition, because this is, after all, an art form invented by the French, which they therefore have to protect. And, the French do give all sorts of financial help to all sorts of cultural activities which we would regard as purely private. Bookshops can get grants. That sort of thing. You would never consider a bookshop applying for a grant from the Ministry of Culture.
Well, my instinctive reaction is, if you can't make money on your own, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be doing something else, and that kind of shows that kind of vulgar,
shows that vulgar materialism of the British.
Yeah,
and the British Empire was, after all, people were very proud in the 19th century and indeed the 18th century that the British Empire was a commercial empire. It was not based on conquest, at least that's what they like to think.
Yeah.
It was not based on compulsion. It was, at least the best aspects of it were that it was a commercial organisation to which people wished to belong. And it was a way in which everybody would be able to make money out of trade. And it was thought to be the first empire in history that was based on commerce and not on conquest. Of course, many people today would say it was based on conquest, but it wasn't entirely based on conquest, and it wasn't perpetuated by the constant exercise of force, despite what some rather activist historians say.
So going back to kind of the profession of history, then, I mean, you see the activist class everywhere.
Yes.
Including in history.
Yes.
Is that a new thing?
No. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm all in favour of the marketplace of ideas, even if I think many of the ideas that some of my colleagues are propagating are rather silly and even dishonest. But then that's always been the case.
Yeah.
And the thing that is dangerous is when the free flow of ideas, the marketplace of ideas, is being shut off. So, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when I was doing my PhD in France, the French Communist Party was still extremely powerful in the universities, and you could have your career destroyed if you wrote a book or wrote an article that seemed to question the Marxist interpretation of French history. You said, well, the French Revolution wasn't really about the peasants revolting. There wasn't actually all that much difference between the nobility and the peasantry. The nobility and the bourgeoisie, so it wasn't really a bourgeois revolution, or, things like that. Then you could find that you were simply not going to be given a job, or you wouldn't be given promotion anyway. So I think there's nothing new about it, but it seemed in the 1980s and 90s that this was something that we had escaped from. Postmodernism originally was much of it was a rejection of Marxism. You should be suspicious of meta-narratives, and the great meta-narrative was Marxism. So you suddenly become free to say, actually, the evidence doesn't fit the Marxist theory, and no one's going to give you the sack, and you're not going to have students interrupting your lectures anymore. But then what you get instead, of course, is that postmodernism itself becomes somehow transmuted into another form of oppressiveness. There are certain things that must be said and other things that can't be said. And the idea that history is, maybe an ill-tempered exchange of ideas, sometimes an angry one. People get very attached to their ideas and they get very annoyed with their colleagues. Fair enough. But what should not happen, and I think did not happen until recently, is that people would find that they would be very well advised not to talk about certain things. Not to follow certain kinds of research, or if they did, to keep it very quiet, because their career would not be helped by this.
And has a lot of that stemmed from is this just a continuation of many hundreds of years of sort of Christian... Let me wind back. So we're talking about wokeism here and sort of cancel culture and that kind of thing. And there's an argument to say, Marxism itself, which is the kind of origin, or cultural Marxism or Gramsciism is the origin of wokeism, and Marxism is effectively in itself a version of Christianity. So it's that kind of Christianity itself is a very radical religion. It's got that. It's in the days of ancient Rome, where morality lay in strength and wealth. The stronger you were, the more that was right. And then you had this guy come along and say, well, actually, the meek shall inherit the earth, and the first should be last, and the last should be first. And there was this sort of utopian confiscatory element to it. And what we're seeing now in kind of capitalism versus Marxism is just different branches of Christianity fighting each other. And you get that desire to be awkward and difficult as a radical, and that has positives in it. So let's say, for example, in the the abolition movement for slavery, you would have awkward radical dissenters going, God, that lump of sugar you put in your tea there has probably got some slave blood in it. You shouldn't. And then the person's there, I just want to have a cup of tea with some sugar. Can you just leave me alone to enjoy my tea? And
yes.
And so there's positives to that, but then there's that need to just be constantly radical just sticks with you. And one of the things I remember very strongly from the English in their history that you wrote was that the majority of England had that sort of Anglican Toryist kind of just leave me alone, let me get on with my life. I don't need to have you on my case about cancelling this person because of this. So is where we are today, that's a very long way of asking, is where we are today just how it's always been in various degrees. And you described that when you were in, with the French Marxists, for example.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a very interesting question, which would probably take a very long time to try and give an adequate answer to. I mean, okay, you may say, well, there are always psychological elements by which some people, for whatever reason, are impelled to not to let other people get away with doing things that they think are bad. The Puritans, the evangelicals in the later 18th century, the dissenters in the 19th century, and now various left-wing activists and so on. They're people who who are morally impelled, or who get some sort of kick out of saying that, showing that they are the people who are right and morally superior to their, and they may be right, maybe they are, but there's a sort of psychological part of that. And then there's nowadays, and perhaps there always has been, or at least there has been at certain times, there are also career benefits in this.
Yeah. Okay.
And I don't think one ought to underestimate, let's say, the slightly cynical jumping on bandwagons of people who are actually make a career out of this kind of thing too, whether it's getting elected to office or getting jobs. Whatever,
or just shouting about self-promoting by being virtuous.
But there's a lot of money in some of this stuff.
We like a victim, right? That Christianity is an underdog religion.
Well, yeah, usually yes, but usually I suppose Christianity at its best is saying that I am the sinner. It's for me to repent. It's not for me to tell you to repent. There's the famous Jesus' parable, which I rather like, of the Pharisee and the publican, in which the Pharisee goes into the temple and walks up to the front and says, "Oh God, I thank thee that I'm not as other men," like this awful publican here who's a sinner, and the publican is at the back saying, "Oh God, forgive me, I'm a sinner." And Jesus says he's the man who finds favour in the sight of God because he recognises his own faults. It's not the man who says, "I'm really a very good person, look at me," who is the one who is. And I think Christianity hasn't always practiced what it preached, to put it mildly.
No.
But what it preached, at least, was humility and a recognition of one's own sins. And I think much of what passes for morality nowadays is an assertion of one's own moral superiority and blaming other people, often blaming long dead people for things that you find unacceptable in the world today. But and of course it's much easier to blame people in the past than to look at what's wrong with our society. I'm not a member of the Church of England, though I'm like many people in England. I'm a sort of what's I suppose called a cultural Anglican.
Yeah.
But I find it extraordinary that the Church of England has decided it will give away £100 million in reparations for slavery, and that seems to me an absurd piece of virtue signalling.
Well, I was I'm doing a deep dive in Tolstoy at the moment.
Yes.
And there's a bit in Resurrection where he refers to an abolitionist campaigner in America called, I believe, Thoreau,
Yes.
Who said that in a society where slavery is commonplace, the only moral place for us to exist is in prison, because if you're going to imprison everyone else, you should therefore live in prison. Yeah. So this was Thoreau kind of applying to himself a standard that he could never live up to, and he didn't live up to when he was alive, but he was trying to say that as a, and I imagine people, activists today are going, well, if I was around during the time of slavery, I would have been throwing myself in prison because it would have been all too awful, and I would have been, at the forefront of the campaign to stop this. And
I suppose they do. I suppose they might think that. Though, of course, it's the thing you're supposed to say is that it wasn't white abolitionists who abolished slavery. It was slaves themselves by rebelling and so on. So you might say, well, that's an interesting thought. Let's have a look at the evidence. If that were true, then fine. It just seems not to be true. It seems, that the slave rebellions, some of which succeeded, most of which failed, made people realise that slavery as a system was cruel, expensive, and all that. But it wasn't. I don't think anyone could seriously say it was enough to destroy a system that was, after all, extremely profitable.
Yeah.
And it took in the United States. It took, as we all know, the bloodiest war in American history to put a stop to it.
And not only was it profitable, but I guess for millennia it was the norm, right?
It was the norm, yeah.
And it took the Royal Navy considerable effort to stop it.
Yes, to stop it as far as it was ever stopped. Of course, in parts of the world, it was never stopped. I know someone who told me, somewhat to my surprise, that her parents were brought up by slaves.
Yeah.
So in the Middle East and parts of Africa, and elsewhere too, slavery of a traditional kind still exists, as we know, and various forms of modern slavery exist on a huge scale. But that's people. The activists are not interested in that. They're only interested in things that can be blamed on us. Though it seems, people often say this is self-flagellation, but it seems to me it's not usually self-flagellation. It's flagellating other people. It's, as you said, maybe they would like to think of themselves as being always on the side of good. Had they been there in the 18th century, they would have been the good guys.
This is Jordan Peterson's argument that, if you're probably more likely to be the concentration camp guard than you would be the inmate if you were to, be honest with yourself in many ways.
Yes.
Or, it's up in the air at least, whereas we like to imagine ourselves as nobler than...
We do, I agree. And that's something that we should be very careful not to do. And indeed the Christian message, and I'm not a Christian, would indeed be to say, I am a sinner. I cannot pretend that I would have been one of the heroic and noble people who fought back or who gave their lives for others. A few people did, but most people didn't. And there's a famous book by an American historian called Christopher Browning called Ordinary Men, and he analysed a German police battalion that was sent to the Eastern Front to murder Jews, and he found out that in fact they were pretty ordinary blokes. They were not being coerced into it. Most of them were willing to do it because not to do it their mates would think they were soft, that kind of thing. So their reasons for doing it were actually quite trivial. And so, you have to recognise that human beings are not only capable of doing awful things, they're actually quite willing to do awful things in certain circumstances.
So at the end of War and Peace, Tolstoy goes on this big rant about free will and why do men voluntarily choose to go and slaughter millions of other men. He was talking about Napoleon and
yes,
and then later on in his life in Resurrection, he poses the question again, and he said, whenever I'm trying to find an answer to this, why do people throw each other in prison or oppress each other? All I get is grandstanding arguments about free will rather than an answer. The study of history, has various branches. The Great Man School, or it's all about geography. It's all about, I think you've alluded to it in your work, where kind of war drives trade, war shaped institutions more than ideology ever did, whereas some people argue it's all about Locke and Hobbes kind of thrashing it out. Why do you, I mean, easy question, but why do you think such horrible things happen beyond the fact that we're all sinners on such a scale?
Well, you're asking me very deep questions, which historians tend not to answer. You know, philosophers may ask these questions, or novelists like Tolstoy. But after all, what historians are generally trying to do is to say what happened and why it happened, but at a fairly superficial level. I'll try and get onto your question, but you know, if sometimes if someone say, you know, what's it like doing history, I say it's a bit like describing a football match. So you know, you can. Most of it we agree on. Most of it is fact. We know where the match took place. We know who was playing. We know the names of all the players. We know how many goals were scored. We know when they were scored, how they were scored. All that. None of that is a matter of debate. And so when people say, "Oh, well, history's all about opinion, isn't it?" Or, "Well, no, it's not actually. Most of history is about establishing fact in a way that is, in fact, incontrovertible." But then the other questions are, well, why did Manchester City beat Manchester United? And then you get to let's say more interesting questions, but questions that are very difficult to answer. And then, you know, you can say, well, lots of people have their own ideas. Now, it's conceivable, let's say, for the sake of argument, that some historian of sport in years to come could come across the training instructions of the team that won and could say, well, I know that what gave them an edge that day was that they'd adopted a special training regime and they'd practiced these set pieces, and that's a reasonable explanation. But a lot of other people would say yes, but couldn't it have been the way they felt on the day? Their morale was so high, etc. You know, there are lots of true things you can say in history, but there's not, I would say, a single truth that you can impose on everything. So when you say, let's say, why do horrible things happen, or why do wars break out, then I think you've got to start saying, well, what sort of answer do you want? You could say, well, it's because you know, if you're an anthropologist, or I don't know, maybe a biologist, you might say, well, it's because Homo sapiens is a very competitive species. You know, we do fight for territory. A friend of mine who wrote about the causes of wars said, well, we're actually, as historians, not talking about the causes of wars. We're not talking about the causes of violence. We're talking usually about a particular war. So if you're saying, you know, explain the First World War, you might say, well, I'm trying to explain why it happened in August 1914, which is different from saying, well, why is there a war? You know, what causes wars? And then the answer is on a different level of explanation, and it may not be a historical question. You know, historians sometimes say that's not a very historical question, and I think they probably mean this is a question that historians are not capable of answering. We can say what happened, we can say to some extent why things happen, we can go into a lot of detail about things, and as with the case of the police battalion who were killing Jews, we can try and work out who these people were, we can try and work out to some extent their motivation. But then if someone says, well, okay, you've talked about these guys and what they did, but what I want to know is why are human beings so nasty to each other? Then I think you have to say, this is not a historical question. It's a question for moralists or for philosophers.
Is another way of looking at it then, are you trying to identify moments, kind of sliding door moments? So there are things that would have happened anyway, and there are things that happened in the past which set us on another trajectory. So an example that I read of yours is, you know, had Wolfe lost and New France remained, we would have had, possibly, we wouldn't have had the British colonists rebelling against Britain because
it's not my idea, but
the threat of France was more paramount than the threat of the crown, for example. Or let's say, you know, the French outnumbered the Germans 5-1, apart from memory, when the Germans invaded Poland, and for some reason the French just didn't do anything about it, and they didn't. And had they just gone, or had we not? We can get into appeasement later, but are there moments in history? Some people argue that there's so much that it's just big tides, things that are going to happen anyway, and then what we all talk about is the froth on the surface.
Yes, well, you're quite right. I mean, there have been for many years, perhaps always, as long as history as a subject has existed, people arguing about what sort of questions history should be asking and what sort of evidence it should be looking at. So there was the famous Annales school, which I think you were alluding to indirectly, which people say, well, what counts is, first of all, geography. It's the seas, the rivers, the mountains, the plains. That's what determines history. And the politics is just the froth on the surface. It doesn't really matter because, you might say, well, I don't know, because... Let's say because, I don't know, something like this, because the climate was changing in the steppes, then the Hun were bound to invade Europe or something like that. And therefore to talk about, what Genghis Khan had for breakfast or, whether
his military tactics.
Yeah, that's just secondary stuff. Well, yeah, I mean, you can say that, but then you also might say, well, I'm actually quite interested in the secondary stuff because the secondary stuff is in itself quite interesting. And it takes us back to the point you were making. Are we looking at points in which things seem to change, of which August 1914 is certainly one? And that's why things like that, or things like the French Revolution, have for so long preoccupied historians, and in some senses show no sign of being resolved, in the sense that people still argue about these things. And you could say, well, they're such important things that we're not... On the other hand, for many people, this is old-fashioned kind of history. History, not only for the Annales school, who are now themselves regarded as rather, long in the past, but for many people who say history should really be the study of cultures, not of events. So if you wanted to study the First World War, and maybe you wouldn't, you might be interested in something like, I don't know, let's say, cultures of militarism.
Right.
And then you might be looking at how children got dressed up in sailor suits, that kind of thing. Or you might say, what about militarism in the theatre? Or what about, things like that, which old-fashioned historians might have thought rather trivial. But many people today would say that's what's really interesting. And then, of course, you can get into the more, let's say, the more fashionable areas in which you might say, I'm writing a book about transgender people in the trenches in the First World War, which, you smile, but it's perfectly possible that somebody would do that. And of course, for a long time, a lot of stuff on women. You might say, well, most people who fought in the First World War were men. Yes, but we know about them. We forget about them. What we want to know is about the women who were there. We want to recover the feminist or the female aspects of history. Again, fair enough. But some of us might think that the big questions have not been wholly resolved yet and are still worth looking at, and not simply swept aside in a wave of, let's say, sort of cultural history, which also is not necessarily going to come up with answers to questions that most people are interested in or that they feel are very important to them.
Well, can you reading your work, seems like you've shied away from picking a grand unifying theory, or like picking it's about the geography or it's about the culture, and you touch on all those things. The importance of in the relationship between Britain and France of people like Montesquieu or Voltaire, but also the fact that the money. It's all. If someone like Neil Ferguson, it's all about the money. I don't want to reduce his work to this and money, but or you'd mentioned geography. Obviously, our island, this fortress nature of the water that surrounds us is very important.
I did say that the water only became a barrier in the 18th century, really, because when the navy was able to dominate it. Yeah. Before that, the sea is a highway. I mean, it has different effects, but I mean, I guess I'm not really a theorist. I mean, I'm quite interested in theories, but I mean, I suppose I use them in the way that a carpenter might use different sorts of chisels. I'm not trying to come up with a theory or apply a theory and say this is the answer to everything. And some very brilliant work has been done along those sorts of lines. And you often see popular books of that kind in shops, which the world history of sugar or the world history of the potato. And then you can say, well, it's the introduction of the potato that explains the whole of subsequent European history, because it was only the potato that meant that European populations could grow and hence Europe dominate the world. So it all comes back to I'm not saying anyone said that, but some people like that kind of simple explanation.
Matt's reading *Sapiens* at the moment, which is a tremendously popular book, and in part of that, it talks about wheat. We ate wheat in Europe, which has a higher protein content than rice in Asia, and therefore, that had a huge impact on geopolitics. I kind of find it quite difficult to get my head around. But
yes.
Part of this discussion, I guess, is focusing. Can we learn lessons of history? Can we, as Keir Starmer today, or Donald Trump, or whoever it is, the next Prime Minister, go, okay, we don't want to repeat the lessons of yesterday. And my on the one hand, you can say, for example, to get that going, was World War II, the causes of World War II, a lot of it driven by trying to avoid World War One again?
Yes. Yes, I mean, it would be nice to be able to apply the lessons of history, but we never quite know what they are.
Yeah.
Or else they're very obvious ones. Okay, I mean, I myself have often written about, in the newspapers, about the 1930s as a key moment, which at least makes us think about our present position. And yes, you could say, well, the stubbornness with which the British and French governments tried to appease Germany in the 1930s helped to make war inevitable. And that, had they been tougher, they could have stopped Hitler at an earlier date. Let's say it's a pretty plausible argument. But on the other hand, you could just say, well, if you think that standing up to bullies is a good idea, in the school playground, if you tell your kids to hit people back if they hit them, or perhaps people don't do that nowadays, or if you believe in, telling people on trains to turn their phones off, is this a good way of proceeding? Then you'll think, yes, you see, Chamberlain was wrong and Churchill was right. So the lessons of history may be either very obscure or very obvious, and in neither case is that necessarily all that helpful. In the case of the 1930s, I guess at least you could say it helps us to think about our present situation. And one thing I think it now seems to me it helps is to appreciate how very difficult it was for someone like Chamberlain, who was obviously a flawed politician. But he was, as you said, he was doing his best to prevent what he quite rightly believed would be a global catastrophe, which would destroy millions of lives. And therefore he was desperate to find some way of warding it off. And you can sympathise with that, but you can also say, well, he did eventually realise that that just being nice to Hitler was not going to work. And he did eventually take the risk and take a rather brave decision, which was potentially very unpopular, of saying we're going to increase our defence spending just in case. And you could say, well, should we be today at least willing to contemplate that and realise that are we in a position that's similar in some ways? And if so, are we behaving in a way that is more irresponsible than that of Chamberlain, who was so much criticised afterwards? Because we're just hoping for the best. We're just hoping that, it may never happen.
Well, we've outsourced here in Europe our
defence to
America. We've outsourced our manufacturing to China. Yes. We've outsourced our entrepreneurship and innovation to America to a large degree, and we seem to. Why don't we? There's a quote from you do. Here we are. I'm just, for people listening, opening Professor Toombs's English and History to a chapter you quote Orwell. Towards the end of the book, and Orwell says, "Nothing ever stands still. We must add to our heritage or lose it. We must grow greater or grow less. We must go forward, not backwards. I believe in England. I believe that we shall go forward." Reading your previous book, That Sweet Enemy, you get this sense of competitive tension driving England and driving France to kind of, and within Europe more broadly. Neil Ferguson talks about this, for example, with that competition between states drove Europe forwards, and we feel like we don't have anything to scare us or motivate us anymore, because everything's done by everyone else, and it's all about having a nice holiday and welfareism and all that kind of stuff. Do you think for us to get out of this funk, we need to the pithy comment people say, we need a good war, which is a horrible thing to say, obviously, but like, do you see where I'm coming from that in terms of for Orwell to kind of be right there, we need to kind of get something back, that kind of vigor and mojo that we've lost in some ways.
Well, if I were writing that book today, I'm not sure I'd put in that Orwell quotation as an epigraph.
Why not?
Because I don't feel so confident as I did then. I've often argued against declinism and what seems to be a lazy and rather ignorant view that that Britain was once a superpower and now it's just a small country that doesn't count. And I've said, well, first of all, it was never a superpower, and secondly, it's a country that still counts, at least if it wishes to.
Yeah.
We're still the fifth largest economy in the world, major soft power, armed forces that still are, or were at least, regarded as quite powerful, formidable, and with a determination to actually try to do things in the world, to count. I'm not so sure that that's still the case. I mean, we may be in decline now. We may be precipitously in decline by our own choice.
Yep.
Not alone in this. It may be, as you suggest, that the whole of Europe has fallen into this kind of trap. And I think the explanations are precisely as you say. A long period of peace, for which thanks. Wars are not good things, and they don't produce good outcomes. Very rarely, anyway. They may prevent worse outcomes, but they're never positive experiences. But yes, we've had a long period of peace, a long period of prosperity, a long period in which nothing really bad happened. COVID was about the worst, but it was hardly the Black Death after all.
Yeah.
And as you say, we always thought America could bail us out in every conceivable way. And that's true of all the European countries, even those like France, which are to some extent anti-American, at least in their rhetoric. They've still relied on America to defend them. And now, all of a sudden, that seems maybe not possible. And we now say, oh gosh, yes, we really have to do more to defend ourselves. But on the other hand, we haven't got any money, so we can't. Because we're spending it all on other things, and nobody wants to cut back on welfare or cut back on whatever.
Green energy or whatever.
So therefore, yes, green energy, precisely. So therefore, we sort of wring our hands and lament the fact that we are not capable of defending ourselves, and that the Americans may no longer be willing to do it for us, and yet we're in a position of not knowing what to do, or not being able to do it, or not having politicians who are as brave as Chamberlain was.
It's even more perverse than that. I think we won't even, a lot of professional politicians or members of the elite establishment will argue that it's not America that's kept us safe, it's the European Union, for example. It's Europe. The Union has brought peace, and that's almost to deny the existence of something like NATO. And I know NATO's come under criticism now, but it's just very perverse to not even accept the reality, let alone sort of accept it, but kind of not do anything about it.
Yes, I mean, I don't know if people who say that seriously believe it. Are they saying that that the EU has prevented a war between France and Germany, but no such war is conceivable? Yeah. It hasn't prevented a war between Ukraine and Russia. It didn't prevent the bloody breakup of Yugoslavia, although the EU was set out to restore order in the Balkans. Couldn't do so without American help, because nobody was willing to make the effort. So, I mean, I think people who say, well, the EU has brought peace, don't really know what they're talking about.
No.
Because it's just factually not the case.
So, just winding back the clock, either we're in need of some either great leadership, or we're in need of some sort of external factor to kick us out of stupor, and maybe the latter will bring the leader to do that.
I guess we must hope for that. But I remember I used to think that only a Russian attack in Europe could bring the EU together. Because I used to, this is well before Brexit. I used to think, well, the EU is not a very, EU solidarity is not very visible. But if the Russians attacked, maybe that would force all the European countries genuinely to set up some sort of federation. It would kick them out of their complacency. Well, of course, it hasn't done that. It's done the opposite. It's tended to split the EU countries further apart, so that some want to placate Russia, some are willing to stand, or at least say they're willing to stand up to Russia. But it certainly hasn't made the EU a more effective organisation. As for NATO, well, as you say, NATO basically meant an American protectorate over Europe. If the Americans say we're not willing to do this anymore, it leaves Europe extremely vulnerable. Okay, Russia is big, has quite a lot of people, and yet economically and scientifically it's fairly primitive.
Yeah.
Its economy is about the same size as Italy's. I think somewhere between Italy and Spain. So, it shouldn't be able to make this kind of impact on Europe, but it is doing so because the European states are so passive.
And Russia's sort of barely held together itself.
Yes. Yes.
So, can I ask you therefore about greatness or great leaders?
Yes.
Do you think that's? I'll contextualize it. So, from your book, that Sweet Enemy, you refer to the bicentenary of the storming of the Bastille, where all the European leaders global leaders gathered together. Yeah. And there was a moment where Margaret Thatcher was interviewed, and she kind of said, look, actually, she took a very Burkean angle to it, and said, there was a lot of bloodshed, and it wasn't the best thing ever, and there was a better way of having progressive, and it was all very controversial. She got booed in the streets, but there was no. I can't imagine a Conservative Party leader today. I mean, I remember sort of Liz Truss getting Hayek's name wrong, or not quite knowing who he was, but trying to say, well, I believe in Hayek or something, and that's what I'm doing. I just feel like the caliber of leader in politics today wouldn't have an answer like that.
Well, of course, it wasn't very common then.
Okay.
We're talking about Margaret Thatcher, after all.
Fair enough.
You can imagine that most Conservative politicians at that time would have said, oh yes, fall of the Bastille, terribly important, great inspirer of European freedom, etc., etc. She says, well, we had Magna Carta first, and got very much criticised for it as being rude to the French and being aggressively xenophobic, whatever, as you say. But the quality of politicians is, I think, very difficult. Maybe because I'm not really a British historian. As you say, I've written about England, but
maybe they've always been crap.
Well, I was going to put it in more polite.
Sorry.
Most politicians are, well-meaning, able people, but not many of them have the stature that leaves its mark on world history. We know that. And we can't really expect them to be. And a democracy doesn't expect its leaders to tell it what to do. It expects its governments to rest on the will of the people. If the people no longer have a will or want to avoid difficult questions, then they will not have politicians who will say anything very different, I suppose. The great names, you mentioned Thatcher and you mentioned Churchill. You could mention the two Pitts. These are people who came at time of great emergency and who were not regarded in normal times as people that you particularly wanted to have around. Pitt the elder, neurotic. Churchill, many people would have said, erratic. Even his speeches were criticised as being too pompous until the war came. Mrs. Thatcher regarded as strident and so on. And it's only when there seems to be an emergency that somehow you need the strident people, you need the people who can take decisions, and then hopefully you've got somebody there who can do it. We don't necessarily know who that person is, and we don't know if there will be anybody again, because it could be, as perhaps you're implying, that our whole political culture tends to eliminate in one way or another people of exceptional gifts, or even people who are exceptionally odd.
Yeah.
And that it tends to produce the bland. I mean, I did write a piece in the slightly tongue-in-cheek in the Telegraph a few weeks ago saying we don't pay politicians enough. And I was saying we've always needed professional politicians. I don't think they should all be professional. I don't think there's any need for MPs to be it's not desirable for them all to be professional politicians. And I wasn't saying we should pay MPs a lot more money. I think probably we should pay them somewhat more. But a lot of people who wrote in afterwards said, oh, he wants to pay MPs more money, but they're all crap, as you said. Well, I wasn't saying that. I was saying that what I said was we have always needed professional politicians, people who have spent their whole lives in politics. Yeah. And they are the people whom we call upon in times of great danger. Churchill, after all, was a professional politician. He went into politics. He became an MP at the age of 20, in his 20s anyway. He was a minister in his early 30s. He was in politics then for, 40 odd years in the top of politics. Margaret Thatcher was really a professional.
Yeah.
So were the two Pitts.
So was Lloyd George, I guess.
I suppose so. Yes. Yeah. I mean, so you might say, well, not all professional politicians are by definition great, but I think all the great ones have probably been professionals, because the idea that you just, you walk in off the street, as it were, which some people seem to like the idea of, they say, well, you should only be a politician if you've been a businessman first.
Yeah.
The idea that you walk in off the street and take over the ship of state is, I think, a bit of a fantasy.
So can I, therefore, you made a cursory reference to greatness as kind of leaving a mark of history on history. I know you're going to be more discerning on that shortly. I've been thinking about this, so I've noticed, particularly in sort of business schools,
yes,
or there's the lionization of successful entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs.
Yeah,
there's this resurgence of wanting to study, let's say, for example, Napoleon. Because, can we, as, the Harvard business graduate, learn when I'm going to take over the sort of distribution line of Unilever or whatever, learn from Napoleon's kind of battles, that whether I could be kind of get more market share. And
yes.
So kind of, so greatness as a concept, or great leadership, and then below that is sort of, the next layer is sort of leaving a mark. I've been thinking, and, I would like to try and then go a layer below that. So what do I mean by that? So I'll give you a reference from biology. So if you look at chimp communities, you'll have the alpha male.
Yes.
And the alpha male actually has a very delicate balancing act, because if they're too alpha or too aggressive, which they can be, the other chimps will then eventually, it'll work for a while, but then eventually the other chimps will kind of go, look, we'll put an end to this. This isn't working for us.
Yes.
And so I find this new desire to ape, sorry, I didn't mean that, but ape Napoleon, quite intriguing, because there are certain leaders that, have taken that alpha male chimp approach of being too aggressive, and they've just gone very aggressive, and it's worked for a while until it doesn't. So examples are kind of Alexander the Great, who inherited probably the best armed force of all time from his father, who was actually the real great one, maybe, and then went east until he couldn't go any further, and then he died.
Yes.
Napoleon the same. Julius Caesar, another example, versus people who leave a mark that outlives them. So Gladstone is someone you mentioned, like,
yes,
or let's say Augustus, who's like, okay, I've inherited the Roman Empire. We're not doing any more expansion. If you believe Gibbon, like, this is it. This is the territory of the Roman Empire, and I'm going to try and build something to kind of get us away from the 200 years of infighting and the republic we've had. So, do we need to know more about those leaders who aren't just scorched earth until they kind of do we lionize them too much versus the Gladstonian type leader who kind of actually creates something that outlives them?
Yes. Well, again, very interesting question. I've never been convinced by the, as it were, the great man theory of his. What you're making me say is that I'm a sort of non-theoretical pragmatist who tries a lot of different approaches. I think that's probably true. So at one extreme you could say, as Carlyle did, history is essentially about great men who understand somehow intuitively what their age needs, and they are able to provide it, and that's why you have the age of Caesar and the age of Or of course the other extreme is to say, well, it's all to do with impersonal forces, which it's all to do with economics and the rise of the bourgeoisie or whatever it might be, and that these people are just the figureheads of much wider forces. Well, I think probably most historians who are not determined to have a simple theory would probably end up somewhere in the middle and say that had Napoleon, of course Napoleon's not a bad example because Napoleon was a completely obscure army officer with literary pretensions. Had there not been the French Revolution, Napoleon would have ended his days in a provincial garrison somewhere, trying to write novels like Rousseau.
Yeah. Or even one further, from what you wrote, had Britain decided to defend Corsica, he may have been born British. Which
yes. Well, there's a story, and I think I mentioned this, though I don't think I ever checked it. There's a story that when he was at his military college in France, one of his teachers is supposed to have said, well, you're a bit too clever for the army, why don't you go into the Navy? And maybe you should try going into the British Navy. So you could imagine Napoleon or Admiral Bonaparte fighting alongside Nelson somewhere. But
against Villeneuve.
Yes. Would have been, the odds would have been rather too great against poor old Villeneuve in that case. But so I think it depends very much on the circumstances, of course. And to study Napoleon as if Napoleon on his own will give you the key to increasing your sales share is a bit naive. You can learn things from Napoleon, I think. I'm not a great expert on Napoleon by any means, but I think being a very careful planner, concentrating on logistics, trying to do things that your enemy is unaware of, all these things Napoleon did, but they're all things that you might say common sense would perhaps dictate anyway. But if people can learn these things by reading about Napoleon, why not? I think the danger is to think that somehow there is a unique person or personality type, which if you can somehow copy it, it will make you a billionaire. I think, again, billionaires depend a lot on luck and circumstance, just as successful generals do.
So let's talk about the French Revolution then.
Yeah.
And there are schools of thought who believe it was a function of surplus elites. So you had all these lawyers sort of lying around, kind of out of work, or just is it the third estate that they were in, and kind of Robespierre is an example of that.
Yes.
It's a history that we don't get taught. As I think you've talked about this. History is basically 1066, the Tudors, and then appeasement, and nothing else happens. And so, what is it you think people should know about? It doesn't have to be the French. Any period we can talk about the Glorious Revolution,
yes.
But let's for the sake of where we are, talk about the French Revolution. What should people know about it?
Okay. Can I be, for a moment, a bit contrarian?
Please.
We haven't talked about decolonising the curriculum, but I often have thought, why do we spend so much time studying the French Revolution, let's say? Why don't we spend more time studying revolutions that took place why not study the Taiping Revolution in China? Or why not study the fall of the Mughal Empire in India? Are these not at least as important as the French Revolution? Why do we? And the answer probably was that there was a Marxist view of history, also a Whiggish view of history, that thought that certain events that took place in Europe were of world historical importance, and things that took place outside Europe were not so important. Well, I think we might find that a bit difficult to sustain nowadays. And so if anyone were to ask me, I might say, well, perhaps we shouldn't study the French Revolution as much as we have in the past, unless, of course, you are particularly interested in French or European history, but without having the pretension to say this is somehow the history of the world. But I think the fact is that many people who talk about decolonizing curriculum don't do it very thoroughly.
Yeah.
They just want to add a bit on at the edges, or say you've got to have a few books by ethnic minority historians on your reading list. Whereas if you were to say, well, should we be studying this kind of thing at all, then I think that's sort of beyond the pale. So I'm not, in a sense, against decolonizing curriculum, or at least or decentering Europe, if you do it in a rational way, which does not try to suppress other approaches and force people into a sort of politically correct framework. But having said that, if we are interested in the French Revolution, what should we be interested in? Well, of course, when I say of course, I think very often one's approach to this depends on one's psychological or political instincts. So in some ways, it's not so much that you're learning from history; it's you're imposing on history what you've got in your head or your heart. And so, as I think you were saying a few minutes ago, there might be people who say, well, the French Revolution was such an inspiring leap forward into the age of democracy and the idea of the equality of all people and so on. You know, the end of aristocracy, the end of autocracy. Well, it may not have ended up all that well, but nevertheless, you could say it was a great leap forward and never forgotten. Or, if you have a different kind of sensibility, you might say, think of the terror, think of the bloodshed, think of the horrors that the French Revolution spawned, and think of the horrors that have been caused by regimes that have tried to emulate it, like the Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
That would tend to be my view. But you could say, well, that's not what history is about. History is not so much about judging the morality of things in the past. It's trying to explain why they happened. And in the case of the French Revolution, much of the more than 2 centuries of debate about it has really been trying to say why it happened. Was it due to the rise of the bourgeoisie, the surplus lawyers, as you said? Was there a noble reaction? I mean, I think it was because
bad harvest.
Yeah, bad harvest, volcanoes in Iceland destroying the harvest. I think that doesn't quite fit, but very hot weather in the summer of.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me it's because the old regime ran out of money, and it did so because it was fighting wars against Britain. That would be my simple explanation.
Yeah.
And I think it's the best one. He says arrogantly, not being an expert on this, but it does show us, I think, some of the pitfalls of history as an intellectual activity, in that the assumption for most of the 2 centuries and more since the French Revolution is that the explanation for it must be internal. It must be about what was going on in France. It must be about the exceptionalism of France. It must be about, religious conflict in France, the declining prestige of the monarchy in France, etc. Well, it may be not about any of those things. It may have been about developments in Europe and globally that had a particular impact on France, but could have had the same effect on other countries, and arguably almost did.
Yeah.
So I could tell you a little story which I got from a PhD dissertation that I marked. You learn a lot from this thing. The Duke of Richmond, great and wealthy English aristocrat, who was also a peer of France. He was also Duc de Richemont, I think, or something like that. So he could be a noble in England or he could be a noble in France. And he decided sometime in the 1780s, I can't quite remember when, that England was heading towards revolution. And the safe thing for him to do would be to sell all his property in England and move to France.
Amazing.
Because France was the country where monarchy was safe. And France was a well-governed country where people like him would be much better off than in England. He didn't do it, otherwise he wouldn't still be, his descendants still wouldn't be living in Goodwood. I think that's where they. But that someone who was a seasoned politician, a man of the world, could think that seriously shows us how difficult it is to predict the future, even for people who are insiders.
There at the time. I mean, that's an amazing story, and it again shows the weight we place on rationality, as this is the kind of rational thing to do, even if, I mean, one of the things you talk about is the French in the 18th century sort of rejected at the messiness or the rudderlessness of Adam Smith's sort of market, or the English kind of lack of kind of monarchical absolutism.
Yes.
And preferred that, even running into Napoleonic France with state-directed kind of economic policy. And that feels like the rational right thing to do, even if the outcomes kind of refute that. But I think as you say, we struggle to have 9 or 10 contributory factors in our head at any one time. So we like to have a simple, it's about the harvest or about...
Well, at the moment, we seem to be going back to this, let's say, this rule by an enlightened elite. Yeah. In the way that French royalists in 1780, whatever, said, look how much better our system is than the British. It's orderly. We have a monarch who is not subject to factional manipulation, who stands for the good of everybody. We don't have such a corrupt and divisive institution as the House of Commons. We're much better off than the British. And there are people today, I suppose, you only have to look at certain elements in America who say, look at the dreadful outcome of American democracy. It's Donald Trump. What you need to have are enlightened judges, enlightened civil servants who will, in fact, prevent the deplorables from being able to run the state. And that's always been an objection to democracy. Think what happens if the masses actually get power. What will they do? Yeah. We have to make sure that they never really do. We have to have all sorts of checks and balances. That means, in effect, that the majority decision is not absolute. And we've gone to a position now in which it seems to many people, it seems to me, that the majority can simply be not entirely ignored, but it can be pretty well kept within pretty narrow bounds.
Yeah, I've long been talking about the kind of expert fallacy that we live on, or the expert tyranny that we live under. And what's been encouraging about this conversation is a sense of humility that, despite knowing so much, the temptation is, particularly for activist historians, is to kind of go down that politics route and kind of use their superior factual knowledge to kind of almost browbeat opposition into into believing self-ignorance. And one example of not being so kind of genteel, predictable, and rational is, it feels like Hitler kind of figured out Chamberlain. He knew what he was all about. Whereas, if he was up against Donald Trump, he wouldn't have quite known. Actually, I can't quite get this guy. Maybe he will actually just invade me, or won't take me seriously, or maybe he will if I do. And that that doesn't fit into the kind of neat, genteel, kind of sophisticated expert that we like to think about.
No.
And actually, like, kind of history is more complicated than that, which is great to hear. I want to ask, do you think?
Could I just say something? Well, something you said a minute ago. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It seems to be very wrong and an abuse of their position for historians, or indeed other academic experts, to say, you shut up because I know what I'm talking about and you don't.
I'm the expert.
Yeah, I'm the expert. Well, experts disagree. Experts are often wrong. And the way that academic subjects progress is by experts being disproved. Otherwise, we'd have a solid basis of knowledge that is never questioned. That never happens. And I think, as you say, there are activist academics who have seized on one very simple, or perhaps a number of very simple theories. And as in the days when Marxism was influential, their research fits into the theory. So you find a certain piece of research, you say, well, this is obviously a valid piece of research because it fits the theory, whereas this piece of research is clearly wrong because it doesn't fit the theory. And that still happens. I don't want to mention names. I ought not to mention particular cases, but there has been a fairly recent, it caused some notoriety in limited circles of historians, in which someone made a very revolutionary claim about the Industrial Revolution and the origins of a certain key innovation. And it appeared that this was based simply on a misunderstanding of the evidence. And yet, because it fitted a certain theory and it suited a certain approach, it was simply denied that this could be wrong. And the people who were objecting and saying this is a mistake were silenced. Eventually, we're not permitted to publish. We're told that this was a racist objection. So, in that case, history or any academic subject which falls into that trap ceases to be an intellectual pursuit, really, and it simply becomes a means of a political weapon.
But if you don't believe truth is a thing,
yes, exactly.
then that makes sense, right? If you think there is an objective truth to, or a point to doing all this research beyond putting virtuous statements out there.
Though it's funny because there is clearly a very obvious contradiction in that there are the people who say there is no truth or just lots of different voices tend to think that their voice is the one that is true. Everybody else's voice is just an opinion. Do
you get whataboutery here? Is that a thing? Have you heard of that term?
Yes, I have.
And so, it's exactly that, where you find the accusation of whataboutery still, the person accusing someone else of whataboutery is still implying a hierarchy themselves, but they're just placing their pet project to the top of the hierarchy and yours at the bottom. So
I suppose that's true. I think it's what would often be called putting things into context. Is then said to be whataboutery. I mean, you mentioned slavery earlier and the fact that slavery was a practically universal institution. So if someone who says, well, yes, the British, of course, or indeed the French, the Spanish, etc., were involved in the slave trade, but then slavery was a universal institution and was generally accepted as being part of life. Then you could be saying, oh yeah, but this is just whataboutery, isn't it? You're trying to deny or limit, to downplay the guilt of one particular accused party. But the
slave trade was also a trade.
It was a trade.
So there was a buyer and a seller, and the seller wanted to buy other things. I think, textiles from England and spices from India, and they exported human life to receive that. And those people aren't your typical, racial profile that is involved in the discussion of slavery today. And it kind of it circles back to that point of, are you trying to be an expert and find the truth, or are you trying to be an activist? And and then again, going back to Marx. So Marx, by and large, sort of was using a very theological perspective, but backing it up by science. And so science became the new religion, using graphs and charts rather than saying, well, because God decrees it.
Yes.
And so now we have this sort of scientific belief and expertise that sort of pervades.
Particularly Engels was very keen on saying this is a scientific theory, proved. It's not a matter of debate or opinion, it's a matter of simply accepting the truth or rejecting the truth.
So can I ask you about some of your future work that you've got planned, and give you a kind of hypothetical to try, sort of kick that off? So let's say Scotland votes to be independent of the Union, and then 3 or 4 years down the line from independence, or whenever, they slash corporation tax to 10%, they deregulate, they invite English businesses to come and set up in Scotland and become, the promised land that Adam Smith always wanted them to be, and you get this resurgence and competitive tension again between England and Scotland, and we're kind of best of enemies but best of friends again, and we can actually sort of, move on.
Yes.
And actually that's a kind of one perspective, that actually independence for Scotland will be better for England, better for Scotland. We should have done it with Ireland 100 years earlier than we actually did. And are we just repeating that mistake again by not allowing the people of Scotland to self-determination?
Well, we do allow them self-determination after we allow them.
I'm being dramatic, but yes.
Yes. Of course, your scenario is very much what in recent years the Irish have done in cutting tax. And it's been very beneficial to some extent in Ireland. I believe that it hasn't really filtered down or trickled down very much to Irish people, but it's certainly made some people a lot of money, and it's given the government a big financial surplus. And in theory, there's nothing to stop Scotland from doing the same, though the sort of government that would be likely to run Scotland in the event of independence, on the face of it, does not seem very likely to be a sort of to want a Singapore on the Clyde. So I think I'd have thought it's more likely that Scotland will become much less well governed. Okay, that's my prejudice, if you like. As you may know, I'm writing a history at the moment of the Union of England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, which is in a sense a political project, in that I think it is politically useful for people to know the history of this institution, which is the United Kingdom, which I don't think most people do. In fact, I didn't. I still don't. I know a bit of it now, and I hope I'll know a lot of it in a few years' time. But I think when we're going to talk about the future of the United Kingdom, we at least ought to know something about the history of its existence. And here's your question earlier about, is history useful? Well, I think at least it's useful in, I hope, dispersing myths. So it's sometimes said the Scottish National Party is very anti-imperial, in the sense that it criticises the British Empire because it wants to show Britain as guilty of colonialism and Scotland as somehow pure and separate. Whereas at least it's worth knowing, and many people do know this, but not everyone, that Scotland was in fact hugely involved in and committed to the empire, that Scots were disproportionately involved in all imperial activities, and Scotland, the Scottish economy certainly benefited in a very major way from the empire. So if the Scots want to criticise the empire, they're also criticising their own history.
Were they also most keen on fighting the Americans in the War of Independence?
Yes.
Versus the English were and the Irish were kind of not that bothered by it.
Yes, I think that's true.
Yeah.
So I think we ought to at least know that. I don't know what conclusion I'll reach in the book. It's too early to say. I have a sort of a sympathetic or let's say a sentimental attachment to the idea of the United Kingdom and to the link with Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. But I might come to the conclusion in the end that perhaps it's reached its sell-by date and it would be a good thing for it to break up. I don't know. I think it seems to me there's nothing wrong with writing history from a political point of view, as long as you're willing to
be open,
and also be willing to prove yourself wrong. You may start off with a certain intention and find out that actually you were wrong. Your prejudices were not well founded, and the case that you point out of Ireland, it would certainly be arguable that Ireland should never have been made part of the United Kingdom. That Ireland should have been allowed home rule at an early date, and that would have saved us all a great deal of trouble. But again, it's worth finding out why this didn't happen. And
there was an ethno-nationalism to Irish independence versus, let's say, Scottish independence.
But it's interesting what I discovered recently, and again, if there are Irish historians listening, they will know this. That Irish nationalists, or most of them, were quite pro-imperial because there was a large Irish diaspora in Australia and in Canada, and they thought of themselves ideally as being a dominion. That was what they wanted, to be a dominion within the empire, like Australia. They didn't want complete independence.
No, I mean, this was a debate.
Not against the empire.
Was it Michael Collins versus de
Valera?
De Valera, where one side would argue that, a bit like in the Brexit debate, where Remainers would argue if we left, we wouldn't actually leave. We'd be kind of stuck. The orbit of the EU would be so great, the gravitational pull, that we would never be able to kind of carve our own path. And that was an argument happening in Ireland as well. That the pull of Britain was just too large, that we will never be able to properly leave.
Well, I think that arguably that's what happened. That Irish independence, in a sense, didn't make much difference. It made the Irish poorer. Perhaps it still does. It made them probably less influential in the world, in the sense that you could easily imagine, Irish politicians holding high positions within the United Kingdom and being able to stand up for Irish interests within the kingdom and also in the world. Ireland deliberately making itself a backwater, and under De Valera wanting to become a Catholic rural peasant society, meant that Ireland became very much poorer than it was set to be before. And Irish people were leaving in droves.
Yeah.
So I don't think you could say that Irish independence was a great success, but that's the sort of thing I'll be looking at. I mean, it seems to me that at the moment is that the United Kingdom has been fundamentally about playing off the interest of its different parts and trying to come up with a common interest. If they became separate, those things would not go away. There would still be, as you said, the predominance of England.
Yeah.
And the likelihood would be that an independent Scotland and an independent Wales, like an independent Ireland, would be to some degree satellites of England. Of course, some of them say, well, we'd be in the EU, wouldn't we? So in that case, they'd become satellites of the EU.
Yeah.
But then many people would prefer that, because insofar as Anglophobia is a big element in nationalism, they prefer to be provinces of the EU than provinces of the United Kingdom, if one can put it that way. But I think the other thing is it's always also been about security, and it's been the long period of peace that has meant that this seems somehow no longer relevant. Well, with the rise of the Russian threat, and indeed possibly the Chinese threat, and of Russian submarines in the Irish Sea, suddenly perhaps it doesn't seem quite so risk-free to break up the United Kingdom. And if the threat from Russia continues, then the very old argument for the UK, which is about the security of the islands, will become more stronger.
Yeah. When do you think we might be able to read the conclusion of your research? When do you think that might be ready?
I'd like to say it'll be ready in 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can sit down again and talk.
That'd be very nice if we could. Yes.
So, actually, before I get on to my final question,
Yes.
if you can indulge me for a few minutes longer, I have a special kind of interest at the moment, which I try and avoid bringing up in all podcasts. Which I can see Matt shaking his head. But can you tell me a bit about the Physiocrats, if you know about them in great detail?
I don't know about them in great detail.
Yeah.
But the idea was, and many of these 18th century economic ideas are worth revisiting, because they can still at least make us think. But they believed that that agriculture was the basis of all real wealth, as we might nowadays say manufacturing. Things like the City of London, all this kind of trading is really pretty artificial, and it could easily collapse. But they thought that agriculture was the thing that the wealth of nations was based on. And therefore what you should do is to free up the trade in grain, and that would encourage, in some ways quite a modern idea, free up the trade in grain, get rid of all the restrictive practices on the grain trade, and that would encourage farmers to produce more because they would sell more, etc. Which you might say, well, that was a very good idea in theory, as many economic ideas are in theory, just that in practice it meant that certain parts of the country found that they were starving, and other parts of the country where they could afford the price of grain were fine. And therefore the people who were in the hungry parts of the country thought this was not such a good idea after all. And it was much safer to, as it were, level up by trying to control the supply of grain in different parts of the country. Otherwise you were heading for trouble. Well, that's still a problem to some extent we face. Do you let economic liberalism rip? And do you say, well, if you're out of work tough, you can live on the dole, or you can try and get a job in a, delivering
Driving an Uber, or
that sort of thing. Or you can say, maybe it's in our interest to defend at least our strategic industries. It's not something we've been very good at, but it's an argument that's still going, I think. I think Smith was influenced by the Physiocrats, and as I understand it, he was partly influenced by the idea that you didn't depend on the quality of government for economic success. And that's one of the things that made him think that the market in itself, as an autonomous force, would bring about growth. Because after all, France didn't have a very good government in many ways. It didn't at least have a government that was encouraging free trade. But nevertheless, France was quite a prosperous country, and therefore perhaps you didn't need a government after all. What you did need was for the market to be free.
Yeah, so the reason I ask is I first came across them in the works of a 19th century economist called Henry George, who was talking about
land,
yes, and how. So you've heard of him, brilliant.
Yeah.
So
he was hugely influential at one time.
Yeah, and I think he's going to have his day again, because
yes.
my view is that a lot of at least the economic problems we're facing here are kind of extortionate land value. And
yes.
This was something that Adam Smith and David Ricardo subsequently were very on top of.
Oh, were they?
And influenced by the Physiocrat school when Smith went to France,
yes.
and learned from them. And so Henry George sort of talks about the Physiocrats. And what was interesting from I keep calling it your book, and I must actually be precise. You co-wrote it with your wife, Isabel.
Yes.
Which I think in terms of relationship goals, writing a history book with your wife has to be kind of the pinnacle of having a strong, solid marriage.
We had a good time, yeah.
But there was a French physiocrat finance minister, is it Turgot?
Yes.
Turgot,
yes.
who
was a great philosophe, a great Enlightenment figure.
Right, and that could have been a sliding door moment for France, where had they recognised that kind of land inequality was one big issue driving discontent. And there was actually, again, Henry George talks about this with the potato famine, for example, where you had plenty of food. It was the fact that Irish commoners were pushed down to subsistence levels due to high rent. That kind of forced.
Yes. Well, I'm not sure. Well, I think some people would disagree with that.
Yeah.
After all, the potato famine was a unique, in the history of Europe, a unique famine. The number, the shortfall in food supplies was enormous. It was something like 20 million tons of potatoes. Well, it's not easy to replace that, whatever you do.
Sure. Yeah.
And indeed, it couldn't. I think it couldn't have been replaced, given the limitations on infrastructure at the time. But so there was going to be an Irish famine anyway, I think.
Yeah, there was that kind of, I guess, very vivid image of sort of food being exported to Britain, England.
Yes.
Whilst there was sort of past carts of dying people,
Yes, that's a bit of a myth.
One of the myths out there.
It is. There were food exports, but there were far greater food imports.
The other thing I want to give you a chance to kind of put right, which I remember from towards the end of English in history, was the role of Britain in World War II.
Yeah.
Which you feel has been subordinated somewhat.
I think it has.
America and Russia.
I mean, I think it's worth our at least reflecting on. We often say how much we honour the generation of veterans. We might at least try to assess their contribution fairly. And I think as I say in the book, I think that it's been overshadowed by a largely American-dominated culture of the Second World War, Hollywood movies.
Yeah.
And also to some extent an ideological, though this to some extent disappeared now, but a stress on the importance of the Russians. Whereas, and a tendency to underestimate what Britain's role in the war, which was enormous. And also I think too, this will be the final point, something that began to be underestimated at the time, and to some extent for moral reasons, an unwillingness to accept that the bombing of cities was actually very important. Because you could say it was horrible. Bombing Berlin, bombing Hamburg, bombing Dresden, those were awful things. We don't really like that idea. And better still, we can say it wasn't effective. It just made the Germans more determined to resist. Therefore, and that was Britain's great contribution for much of the war. Okay, at sea as well, but that was... So if you say, well, that wasn't very important and it wasn't very nice, then it tends to downplay Britain. Whereas I think at least recent research suggests that the effect of the bombing campaign was huge, partly in what it destroyed, but also because it forced Germany to devote a vast part of its war effort to air defence, so that the Eastern Front was relatively undefended. And by the time of D-Day, the German Air Force had been more or less wiped out. So
And even you allude to the fact that sort of 40, 41, Britain was alone, and had they caved and collapsed or done a deal,
Oh,
then
well, yes.
there was no America. There was,
Yeah.
I mean...
Yeah. You know, this is... We love it. They're very tempting to do these counterfactual analyses. What if Churchill had agreed to peace talks and so on? And usually it seems to me you can go a short distance like that, but you can't go very far like that. You could say, well, yes, then we would have made peace with Hitler in 1940. And then what? Well, that the Nazis would have dominated the continent. But then we can't say, would it have lasted long? Would their power have collapsed? Would there have been general resistance? Would they have fought the Russians? Would the Americans have, you know? So I don't think you can go very much further than that. But at least you can say that if Britain had made peace in 1940, the Nazis would inevitably have dominated the continent for the foreseeable future. They would almost certainly have defeated Russia. And their whole plan was of a genocide in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
They would have had access to Middle Eastern oil supplies. The Americans would have kept out, because how could they enter a war if Britain had made peace? So we would have been looking at an indefinite period of fascist control of Europe in alliance with Japan, another semi-fascist state.
It's not worth thinking in any way.
No, it's not worth it. It would have meant the deaths of more tens of millions of people. So I think we can say, and here is where it seems to be the great man theory for once works. If Churchill had not insisted and, in a sense, bullied his cabinet, or at least persuaded his cabinet not to contemplate peace, then the likelihood is that we would have made peace. There was nobody else to stop it. Yeah. And most of Parliament probably would have gone along with it. So that would have happened. I think we can say pretty clearly that would have happened without Churchill. And in this case, an individual did have incredible importance
to the path that
yes.
world events
and
took.
An individual with his peculiarities too.
So, as you know, I try to wrap these conversations up with a closing question that I call the long bet.
Yes.
Where you're given a 10-year time horizon to make a prediction of something you would like to happen or you think will happen, either and or both. And there's no sort of hard and fast rules about it. It's just a bit of fun. So don't worry, no one's going to hold you to it.
Yes. Okay. I've got an optimistic and a pessimistic one. So the optimistic one would be a breakthrough in the technology of nuclear fusion.
Yeah.
So the climate crisis can be solved without impovering us all. We don't have to build windmills on every hillside, and so on, all that. But that's...
So a 21st century technology, not a 14th century technology is
yes,
the hope.
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, scientists say, it will happen one day. But then there are lots of things that are always going to happen in 10 years' time, and then it's another 10 years.
We're always 20 years away from fusion.
Exactly.
But I think we are getting closer, to be fair,
well, I hope
from what I'm hearing from companies that are...
Well, I hope you're right.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's my optimistic one. Though, of course, it wouldn't be so good if it was China who developed it first, probably.
Maybe, yeah.
Though with a technology like that, you can't prevent it from being generally adopted. And nor would you want to, probably. No. So that would be my optimistic one. My pessimistic one, I'm afraid, is that Ukraine is, to some extent, betrayed or failed by the West, and Putin, rather like Hitler after the defeat of France, is hugely boosted in his authority within Russia, and he then invades one of the Baltic states.
Oh wow, okay, and then we're really forced to decide.
Yes, so we'll be in the same situation that Chamberlain was in 1938.
Okay, so can I challenge that? Is that
do?
What perspectives that I have heard on this are that a red line for Russia was Ukraine membership of NATO, and Ukraine's always had this push-pull tension between Russia and Europe, much like we have. In Europe, yes, we're kind of in Europe, but we're not, and when we get pulled too far in, we kind of, Britain is an island nation, or it's a nation of the seas, a global Britain, but it's also a European country. It's both things at the same time. Now, Russia is not this bogeyman that, as you've alluded to, it's just the economy the size of Italy and it's kind of barely held together. It was the West that provoked Russia to invade Ukraine, and it is fueling it by funding Ukraine to the tune of hundreds of billions through the loss of unnecessary lives. And were we to take Ukrainian NATO membership off the table, we can all go back to Putin. Russia's never had this. I think Enoch Powell argued this as well. Like, Russia never had these hugely expansionary, ambitions beyond just keeping itself protected from that wide plain access beyond Poland. So, is it a bit of a bogeyman? Much like, as you alluded to in that Sweet Enemy, the Whigs liked those kind of expensive foreign wars and and kind of foreign intervention, versus the kind of Anglican Tories who are like, just let the world be, it's not our problem, they're not going to do anything, it's not our issue.
Well, I hope you're right that Russia is in fact more sinned against than sinning, and all they want is to live a quiet life. But I'm not. Well, as I say, I hope you're right. I think we'll have to wait and see. But I think it's not true that Russia has not been expansionist. It's been pretty consistently expansionist throughout
Georgia, and then
the Crimea too. And the whole of Asiatic Russia. Of course, you might say the more likely thing is that they'll fall out with China. If the Chinese decide that after all there's lots of bits of Siberia they would like, which the Russians should never have had in the first place. Yeah. So we might have anti-colonialism, which the Kremlin is keen to promote, actually turning against them, which would be poetic justice anyway.
Historic grievances being used.
Yes.
So kind of full circle. Well, look, I've taken too much of your time, and I've still got 100 things I'd love to ask you, but maybe if you will indulge me, we haven't talked about the Sovereign Isle either, but if you would like to have me back when your book on the Union is written and we can deep dive into that, I'd be grateful. In the meantime, we can see if your prediction of either fusion technology or hopefully we'll be sat in a room powered by nuclear fusion. That'd be fantastic.
I hope so.
And hopefully not Estonia being a member of the Russian state again.
Yes.
Then we can do this again. But I'm really grateful for your time. People can find your work, the English and their history, the Sovereign Isle, that Sweet Enemy. Plus you write for the Telegraph and the Spectator, and you're kind of you're not on social media, I believe.
No, I'm not.
No. And are you going to keep it that way? No plans? Probably for your productivity and getting this book done in 2 to 3 years. I'll advise it. But we'll be there plugging your stuff, and I'm really grateful for the time. It's been an absolute blast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
This has been Meeting People. I've been your host, Amal Pandya. This is a podcast produced by Matt Cooper with music composed by Loverman.